The Admiral Hipper class emerged in the mid-1930s as one of Nazi Germany's most ambitious naval projects. At a time when international treaties aimed to limit and monitor battleship design, Germany strove to push boundaries by secretly preparing powerful new vessels. This class of heavy cruisers included 5 ships, the lead vessel Admiral Hipper, along with Blücher, Prinz Eugen, Seydlitz, and Lützow. Only Admiral Hipper, Blücher, and Prinz Eugen would see action for the Kriegsmarine, Germany's navy, during World War II. Seydlitz was nearly finished when work suddenly stopped, and Lützow was sold in an incomplete state to the Soviet Union in 1940. The first major engagements for these cruisers came in April of 1940, during Operation Weserübung, the German invasion of Norway. Admiral Hipper and Blücher led the assault forces through freezing fjords and coastal defenses. Blücher, tragically, was sunk outside Oslo by Norwegian shore batteries and torpedo installations, while Admiral Hipper reached its target, the port of Trondheim. Admiral Hipper later raided Atlantic merchant lanes, targeting Allied shipping. By 1942, she was in northern Norway, stalking supply convoys bound for the Soviet Union. These efforts culminated in the Barents Sea clash of December 1942, known as the Battle of the Barents Sea. In that skirmish, British cruisers battered Admiral Hipper, forcing her to retreat. Prinz Eugen had her own dramatic storyline. She was originally paired with the formidable battleship Bismarck for Operation Rheinübung, a bold attempt to break into the Atlantic and wreak havoc on Allied convoys. Together, they encountered the British battlecruiser Hood and battleship Prince of Wales in the Denmark Strait. Hood was destroyed by German gunfire, and Prince of Wales suffered heavy damage. Soon after, Prinz Eugen continued alone for a time, but experienced engine troubles and had to return to port. By 1942, she dashed through the English Channel, a risky journey dubbed the Channel Dash, to return to Germany. Following this, the cruiser took station in Norway but was torpedoed by a British submarine and had to be repaired in German docks. Admiral Hipper was placed out of active service in early 1943, undergoing partial repairs only to be recommissioned in the fall of 1944 for an urgent refugee evacuation mission in the Baltic. As the war ground to an end, Prinz Eugen was the lone vessel still in frontline service, operating in the Baltic Sea until the final surrender in May 1945. In those final days, Admiral Hipper was ultimately scuttled at Kiel in May 1945, leaving Prinz Eugen as the sole surviving ship of her class. That cruiser became a war prize, ceded to the United States Navy. Her final chapter ended in 1946 when she was used as a target ship for the Operation Crossroads nuclear tests at Bikini Atoll. Meanwhile, the incomplete Seydlitz was scuttled in Königsberg, modern-day Kaliningrad, before Soviet forces could capture her intact, and eventually she was razed and scrapped. Lützow, renamed Petropavlovsk after the Soviet acquisition, never reached full operational status, still managed to deliver crucial artillery support during the siege of Leningrad. She was sunk, raised again, and kept in service in a limited capacity until the 1950s, when she was finally broken up. Design and development. Following World War I, the Treaty of Versailles heavily restricted Germany's naval capabilities. Article 181 specified a maximum of 6 old battleships and 6 outmoded light cruisers, with specific weight limitations for their replacements. By the early 1920s, the Reichsmarine, as the German Navy was then called, began looking to replace its antiquated light cruisers with newer vessels. Although Germany was not party to the 1922 Washington Naval Treaty, its terms indirectly applied. Plans advanced in fits and starts until the London Naval Treaty of 1930 formally split cruisers into 2 categories: heavy cruisers with 8-inch guns and light cruisers with 6-inch guns. When Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, the Treaty of Versailles was essentially discarded. By May 21, 1935, the Navy was reorganized as the Kriegsmarine. Soon after, Germany secured the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, permitting a Kriegsmarine that could be 35% the size of the Royal Navy. This provided the legal cover to build heavy cruisers, up to 5 ships of roughly 10,000 tons each, though in practice they would exceed those limits. 3 ships were planned in 1934 and 1935 with 8-inch guns: Admiral Hipper, Blücher, and Prinz Eugen. Seydlitz and Lützow were initially designed as light cruisers, armed with 6-inch guns and triple turrets, yet their design mirrored the earlier ships so closely that the Kriegsmarine decided in 1936 to outfit them with the same 8-inch armament. General characteristics. The Admiral Hipper class varied slightly in dimensions. Admiral Hipper was about 641 feet at the waterline, extending to 673 feet after a clipper bow was installed, while Blücher ran around 640 feet at the waterline and 676 feet overall with her own clipper bow. Beam measurements ranged from roughly 70 to 72 feet, with a typical draft of about 21 feet, increasing to 24 feet under combat load. Prinz Eugen was a bit larger, measuring about 655 feet at the waterline and 697 feet in overall length. Seydlitz and Lützow were designed at 690 feet overall. Though officially listed at 10,000 tons, these cruisers greatly surpassed that figure in reality. Admiral Hipper and Blücher were planned to displace around 17,820 short tons, fully loaded, while Prinz Eugen was closer to 18,710 short tons. Seydlitz and Lützow would have been heavier still, pushing nearly 19,400 short tons. These formidable warships relied on robust, longitudinal steel frames, with a double bottom under much of their length. They sported a flush deck and tall superstructure that housed a forward conning tower and a distinctive tower foremast. Near the ship's center, a hangar and catapult facilitated Arado floatplane operations. At sea, the Kriegsmarine considered them strong performers, though at lower speeds they sometimes drifted unpredictably in strong winds or currents. Each crew typically included around 42 officers and more than 1,300 enlisted men, with that number growing during wartime expansions. They carried a variety of smaller boats, such as picket boats, barges, launches, and dinghies for auxiliary tasks. Machinery. All 5 cruisers were driven by 3 sets of geared steam turbines, each powering a separate screw about 13 feet in diameter. Admiral Hipper and Blücher received turbines from Blohm & Voss. Prinz Eugen's turbines came from Germania Werft, and Deschimag provided the engines for Seydlitz and Lützow. Steam originated from ultra-high-pressure boilers, typically vented through a single large funnel amidships. The first 3 cruisers used a dozen ultra-high-pressure boilers, while Seydlitz and Lützow were to rely on 9 double-ended high-pressure units. In most cases, these power plants were rated at 132,000 shaft horsepower, propelling the ships to about 32 knots, or around 37 miles per hour. Fuel capacity hovered between 1,400 and 1,600 short tons under normal conditions, although they could store well over 3,000 short tons if fully loaded. Cruising at 20 knots, these warships could achieve a range of approximately 7,800 miles. Steering came from a single rudder, and though agile at top speeds, they could lose up to half their speed if the rudder was turned hard over. Armament. The 3 completed cruisers, Admiral Hipper, Blücher, and Prinz Eugen, carried 8 8-inch SKC-34 naval guns, arranged in 4 twin turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft. These guns had a maximum range of roughly 36,600 yards at full elevation. They fired an armor-piercing or high-explosive shell weighing about 269 pounds at a muzzle velocity near 3,130 feet per second. Each ship stored between 120 and 160 shells per gun. Secondary batteries centered on 12 4.1-inch SKC-33 anti-aircraft guns, placed in twin mounts. These had a maximum range of about 19,300 yards against surface targets, with a ceiling near 41,000 feet for anti-air work. Closer-in defenses featured multiple 1.5-inch and 0.79-inch automatic cannons to ward off low-flying aircraft. Over time, modifications increased the number of smaller caliber weapons, especially on Admiral Hipper and Prinz Eugen, which at one point carried up to 28 small anti-aircraft guns. Each cruiser also came equipped with 12 torpedo tubes, arranged in 4 triple launchers on the main deck. They launched G7A torpedoes carrying a 660-pound warhead. These torpedoes typically had 3 speed settings. At about 30 knots, the torpedo could run out to 15,300 yards. At 40 knots, around 8,200 yards. And at 44 knots, approximately 5,500 yards. During later war modifications, improved engines slightly boosted these ranges. For mines, up to 140 feet of rails could be installed at the stern, accommodating a range of naval mines. If a full load of mines was carried, counterweights had to be placed in the double bottom to maintain stability. Armor. Manufactured from specialized Krupp steel known as Wotan Hart and Wotan Wike, the ship's protection system included 2 armored decks. The upper deck was about 1.2 inches thick over critical areas and dropped to less than half an inch forward and aft. Below it lay the main armored deck, ranging from around 0.8 to 2 inches. The main armor belt along the hull sides was roughly 3.1 inches thick around vital sections, thinning slightly toward the stern. Underwater defense involved a torpedo bulkhead about 0.8 inches thick. Turret faces measured about 4.1 inches thick, with similar thickness on the sides and roofs. The forward conning tower boasted sides of nearly 6 inches and a 2-inch roof, while the aft conning tower only had splinter protection around 1.2 inches. Anti-aircraft directors also had splinter shielding to defend against shrapnel. Construction histories. The construction timeline for these ships is both fascinating and chaotic, reflecting the economic and political pressures of the era. Admiral Hipper was laid down in July of 1935 at the Bloemen Voss yard in Hamburg and launched in February of 1937. 2 years later, by April of 1939, she was ready to join the Kriegsmarine. Blücher was built at Deutsche Werke in Kiel, beginning in August 1935 and launching in June 1937. She entered service in September 1939. Prinz Eugen, constructed at the Germania Werft yard in Kiel, was laid down in April 1936 and launched in August 1938, but her final commissioning did not happen until August of 1940. Seydlitz and Lützow were started by Deutsches Schiffenmaschinenbau in Bremen. Seydlitz was laid down in December 1936, with Lützow following in August 1937. Launched in January and July of 1939 respectively, these last 2 never reached completion as heavy cruisers. When the Soviet Union expressed interest in buying German naval technology and vessels in October 1939, the Kriegsmarine refused to sell Prinz Eugen or Seydlitz, but agreed to sell Lützow, which transferred to Soviet hands in April 1940. Wartime service and fates. Admiral Hipper. Admiral Hipper's war began dramatically when she led the mission to seize Trondheim in Norway during Operation Weserübung in April 1940. On the way, she clashed with the British destroyer HMS Glowworm, which was sunk after a fierce duel. Following the Norway campaign, Admiral Hipper embarked on Atlantic raids, hunting Allied merchant vessels in late 1940 and early 1941. She achieved limited results before returning to Germany via the Denmark Strait. In 1942, she steamed to northern Norway to help disrupt Arctic convoys carrying vital supplies to the Soviet Union. The Barents Sea Battle on December 31, 1942, saw Admiral Hipper heavily engaged by British cruisers and forced to withdraw. Adolf Hitler was so enraged by this outcome that he considered scrapping most major surface ships. However, Admiral Karl Dönitz managed to preserve these vessels from immediate dismantling. Admiral Hipper soon returned to Germany, but after early 1943, she never regained full combat status, serving only briefly for evacuee transport near war's end. Finally, on May 3, 1945, the Royal Air Force bombed and severely damaged her at Kiel, prompting her crew to scuttle the Hulk. In July 1945, salvage crews refloated and towed her to a bay near Heikendorf. She was ultimately cut up for scrap between 1948 and 1952. Blücher, meanwhile, was brand new when the invasion of Norway commenced. She led a flotilla into Oslofjord as the flagship of Rear Admiral Oskar Kummetz. In the early hours of April 9, 1940, Norwegian coastal guns at Oscarsborg Fortress opened fire at close range, dealing devastating blows. Torpedoes launched from concealed shore-based launchers inflicted mortal damage. Raging fires and a severe magazine explosion caused Blücher to roll over and sink, taking many of her crew with her. Despite salvage considerations in the decades after the war, only the propellers were removed, and oil has been drained to minimize environmental harm. The wreck still rests at the bottom of Oslofjord. Prins Eugen. Prinz Eugen's story is perhaps the most colorful. She joined the mighty battleship Bismarck for the fateful Operation Rheinübung in May 1941. The duo encountered the British battlecruiser Hood and battleship Prince of Wales. Within minutes, Hood exploded, leaving Prince of Wales damaged. Prinz Eugen separated from Bismarck to continue raiding alone, but faced mechanical problems. Eventually, she reached a French port for repairs, then took part in the Channel Dash of February 1942, sprinting through the English Channel with other German capital ships. Sent to Norway later that year, she was torpedoed by British submarine Trident, losing much of her stern. A long repair period back in Germany followed. Afterward, Prinz Eugen alternated between training cadets and providing critical artillery support on the Eastern Front to assist retreating German armies. When Nazi Germany collapsed in May 1945, the cruiser surrendered. She was handed over to the United States Navy and dispatched to the Bikini Atoll in 1946 for nuclear bomb testing during Operation Crossroads. Astonishingly, she survived both atomic blasts, but was too radioactive to save. Towed to Kwajalein Atoll, she eventually capsized and sank in shallow water, where her remains can still be visited by divers. With one of her propellers salvaged and displayed in Germany, Seydlitz was roughly 95% complete when work was halted. She sat idle until 1942, when the Kriegsmarine decided that new aircraft carriers might serve them better. The plan was to convert Seydlitz into a carrier, renaming her Weser, but actual progress proved minimal. Her superstructure was largely stripped. Close to 2,400 short tons of material were removed to prepare for a hangar and flight deck. Had she been completed, she might have carried 10 fighter planes and 10 dive bombers, plus a heavy anti-aircraft battery. In June 1943, the incomplete conversion was abandoned. Towed to Königsberg, she was scuttled there on January 29, 1945, just before Soviet troops arrived. Though the Soviets contemplated cannibalizing her hull to support repairs on Lützow, they never pursued it. Instead, Seydlitz was eventually raised and scrapped. Lützow stands out for her abrupt transfer to the Soviet Union before completion. Sold for a hefty sum in Reichsmarks, she departed Germany in April 1940. Renamed Petropavlovsk, the cruiser arrived in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, still missing half her main battery and superstructure. German engineers initially assisted Soviet crews in finishing her, but once Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, progress halted. Even incomplete, Petropavlovsk fired her 8-inch guns to support defenders in the siege of Leningrad until German artillery sank her in September 1941. Undeterred, the Soviets raised her a year later and put her back into action as Tallinn, using her guns in the 1944 offensive that helped break the German blockade. After World War II, she served in secondary roles and training capacities. By the 1950s, the Soviets deemed her outdated, and she was scrapped sometime between 1953 and 1960.